My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 19.1, in which I am fascinated by the idea of Marvel's Western comics. And I don't know why. Well, I know why. But my fascination actually comes from the fascination of other people, and from there, I don't know why. You see, when CrossGen Comics was launched and was doing well, it got a lot of press for publishing books from genres other than superhero. One of the most asked questions at every convention interview that I read online was if CrossGen was ever going to publish a Western comic book. The closest that we got was 2 issues of Crooks, issues 19 and 20, pretending to be Westerns. This left me wondering, why in God's name did people want Western comic books? When I say Western comics, by the way, I don't mean comics from the West. I'm talking about stories featuring cowboys, train robberies, indigenous people, and the wide-open plains and mesas of the American West. I did not grow up reading cowboy comics. Hell, I probably didn't even know that there were Western comics for probably the first, almost 10 years of my comic buying career. The only Western movie that I even recall seeing as a kid was Tombstone. And to be fair, if you're only going to see one Western, I would argue that Tombstone is a pretty good pick. It's got a great story, it's got amazing production levels, complex characters with a great cast. God, what a movie. But this was probably the only Western film that I watched until, probably Will Smith's Wild Wild West, which is as proportionally bad as Tombstone is good. But even knowing that, honestly, I still kind of dig Wild Wild West. It's not a very good movie, but it is a fun movie, and that goes a long way. Most of the Westerns that I've enjoyed have actually been the fun ones over the years. There was Maverick from 1994, starring Mel Gibson and Jodie Foster. There was also Shanghai Noon with Jackie Chan, Owen Wilson, and Lucy Liu. Later on in 2016, I would fall in love with AMC's Hell on Wheels TV series. While I can't say that I love Western stories, I know that it is possible for me to enjoy them. So imagine my surprise as my love for comic book history grew, that I learned that once upon a time, Marvel's best-selling genre before superheroes were Western comics. In writing this episode, I tried to find a solid timeline of what titles came out and what characters were notable and how they all influenced each other. But holy crap, y'all. A lot of comic books in those days would run for 5 issues, get rebranded with a new title for like 2 issues, and then they would get a 3rd new name and then a 4th new name. All of this without changing its publication number. But they would change the starring character, the name of the book, and the story that was being told. So untangling the continuity of these comics is really difficult. To be fair, the original Western comics being published were fairly standalone in their presentation. The stories were all basically 1 issue long, there were no continuing plot lines, and there were very little ongoing concerns. You would pick up a single issue, you would read it, and hey, you're done. And there was no concept, really, of a shared universe for the Western books, like there ended up being for the superhero comics that would follow them. So each Western title stood alone as well, despite many different characters moving through a single book thanks to the constant publication changes. Given that muddled history, I figured that I will at least give you some of the greats. The Masked Raider was Marvel's first Western hero. Created by writer-artist Al Anders for Timely Comics, Jim Gardley appeared in Marvel Comics issue 1, and would stay a feature of the book until issue 12, which was then rebranded as Marvel Mystery Comics. Jim was a rancher who rode a horse named Lightning and fought lawlessness in the American West. In 2019, Marvel actually introduced a new take on the Raider, and he has been an important part of the 2021 Defenders miniseries, which was written by Al Ewing and drawn by Javier Rodriguez, and it's really fun, and it's super good, and I totally suggest you check it out. It is not just a fun examination of the metatextual existence of Marvel comic books, but of superhero fiction in general. Super fascinating book. Really loved it. The Two-Gun Kid was the next important Western hero. Clay Harder, the Two-Gun Kid, was Marvel's first ongoing Western hero to star in his own book. The Raider appeared in Marvel Comics, but he did not star in Marvel Comics. Two-Gun, however, starred in The Two-Gun Kid. His title was launched in 1948 and ran for a total of 10 issues. Eventually, he moved into the omnibus title Wild Western. He would then move back to his own ongoing series again in 1953, picking back up with issue 11. That is a 5-year gap between issue 1 and issue 11. So next time a comic that you love is late, give it some slack. Two-Gun would run that way until issue 60, when creative team Stan Lee and Jack Kirby totally rebuilt the character. The original character, Clay Harder, was revealed to be a dime novel character who inspired the Boston-born lawyer Matt Hawk into becoming the new Two-Gun Kid. This was done to make Two-Gun more similar to Marvel's superhero offerings at the time and hopefully boost the book's lagging sales. Starting with issue 93, this book was solely reprints until its cancellation, and then Two-Gun moved into the anthology book, The Mighty Marvel Western, which also featured reprints. "1955 saw Timely's second form, Atlas Comics, publish The Rawhide Kid, which ran for 16 issues. John Barton Clay, more commonly called Johnny Bart, was an outlaw gunfighter, the best in the West, and got his own rebranding by Lee and Kirby in 1960. His series became a reprint title in 1973 and did not end until issue 151. That is one hell of an impressive run. Like Two-Gun, Rawhide would end his career by moving into the Mighty Marvel Western anthology book. Kid Colt is perhaps Marvel's most prolific Western hero. Blaine Colt saw his father murdered, and eventually he hunted down the men who killed him. Colt killed them in a gunfight, avenging his father, but in doing so, he was also branded as an outlaw. Hence his comics title, Kid Colt, Outlaw. But Colt also appeared in All Western Winners, Wild Western, Two-Gun Western, and Gunsmoke Western before appearing in the Mighty Marvel Western with the other boys. His solo ongoing title ran for 229 issues. And I do not know how that's possible. How many ne'er-do-wells are there in the Wild West for Kid Colt to come across? I would be greatly remiss if I did not mention the Ghost Rider, who is perhaps Marvel's most successful reinterpretation of a Western hero. But Marvel's Ghost Rider wasn't originally Marvel's at all. Ray Crank and Dick Ayers originally created the Ghost Rider for a company called Magazine Enterprises' Tim Holt, issue 11. I don't know if I have heard of a more generic name than Magazine Enterprises, but here we are. They were inspired by the then popular song Ghost Riders in the Sky, which I highly suggest you give a listen to. It is a fun song in general, and Johnny Cash's version in particular is amazing. That version of the character ran through several different books in horror-themed Western stories until the creation of the Comics Code Authority. The CCA was put into place to curb violence, sex, and horror stories in comic books, fearing for the impressionable youth of America. So the Ghost Rider stopped appearing in comics, and the copyright on him eventually expired. Marvel's then publisher, Martin Goodman, stepped in and assigned the name to artist Dick Ayers, with Roy Thomas on plots and Gary Friedrich, who wrote the scripts. Ayers did not know that Marvel technically did not own the original character at the time. Goodman did not purchase the name or copyright. After all, the copyright had expired. He was, legally speaking, free game. And so Goodman just started publishing new comics featuring a character named the Ghost Rider. Marvel's interpretation of the character was named Carter Slade. He was gifted a phosphorescent white costume, including a face mask, cape, and cowboy hat, by the indigenous medicine man Flaming Star. In the 1970s, when Marvel created the newest interpretation of the Ghost Rider, Slade was renamed the Night Rider, but that did not last long. Night Riders was a term originally used to refer to the Ku Klux Klan, who would carry out their horrible deeds at night. Marvel renamed Carter Slade the Phantom Rider, and finally, that's the name that stuck. If Carter Slade is featured in a book now, like he was in 2015's Ghost Racers, he is called the Phantom Rider. There are many more Western characters, books, and stories that I have not even touched upon in this small bit of storytelling. These 4 characters seem to be Marvel's biggest and most enduring out of their characters, so hopefully that'll do you for now. That sense of history is what now fascinates me about Marvel's attempts to keep their Western heroes relevant. Pop culture moved on from Westerns in the late 60s and 70s, and the comic book audience largely did the same. America had begun to grapple with its role in Vietnam and America's legacy there. The simple, glorified vision of America that Westerns portrayed fell out of public favor. Comic books moved away from Westerns, and back towards superheroes, baby. So then, why keep publishing Westerns over the years? Who are they selling these books to? And are there really collectors who are like 80 years old just demanding more Western comics? And for the collectors who started in the 80s or 90s, like myself, these comics are honestly more of a curiosity than they are anything else. Is curiosity enough of a reason for Marvel to keep paying people to make these Western comics that just don't seem to sell very well? Plus, the style and presentation of comic books has changed so much since the 70s. There was one Western miniseries published in 1985 by Marvel, and then Marvel did not publish another one until the 90s. In that time, we saw the rise of superstar artists like Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, causing artists to have as much say in a comic as the writer or editor. We also saw the influx of Eastern influences like anime or manga in the art style of guys like Ben Dunn, Joe Mad, and Roger Cruz. The way that comics were written, the type of camera shots that they would use in their panels, the type of stories that we want to read as an audience, all of that stuff changed during that time. Comics were going through the awkward phase of publishing adolescents, aiming at a more adult audience than the child audience that they used to sell to. So, how do you adapt Westerns to these new forms of presentation? Do you sell them to the new readers, or do you hope that the people who grew up in the 70s still love these characters? A lot of these characters hadn't seen publication in decades. Like I said, as a 90s kid, I sure as shit didn't give a crap about old, lame Western characters. I wanted Wolverine, Venom, the X-Men, and the industry wanted the Punisher, Spider-Man, or the more intense Image heroes like Spawn, Witchblade, or the Wildstorm books. Westerns were of the past, long dead. But this is comics, and continuity is never fully forgotten, nor are copyrights and trademark law. Since the Western books died in the 70s, Marvel has published a number of Western comics, each one really different from the other. Some of those takes are far more realistic, some of them are far more controversial, some of them feel like throwbacks, and some others are a complete modernization of Western concepts. And that is where this streak of episodes is going to come in. You see, I put together a collection of 2004's Amazing Fantasy not too long ago, which was an anthology series that ran for 20 issues. At the end of it, Marvel printed a full page/explanation/ad for the Mighty Marvel Western event. Marvel was basically releasing a series of one-shots about their Western characters written by modern writers. These were also anthologies, featuring more than one story per book, as well as a reprint of a classic story. It's basically a modern imagining of the old Mighty Marvel Western comic series, with materials both old and new. And I ignored this event when I first put together that Amazing Fantasy collection, because come on, why would I buy those books? They had nothing to do with anything. Like, at all. And it's not like I have some weird, lingering fascinations with Westerns, right? But let's say that I did, right? Just for funsies, let's run the hypotheticals on this one. Let's say that I got the Mighty Marvel Western one-shots. What then? So I just take those issues and I stick them in my collection? I mean, was this event tied into anything else? And that led to me researching Marvel's various Westerns. And you know, there was that controversial Rawhide Kids series from 2003. I mean, I could check that out. That kind of has my curiosity. And someone greenlit a sequel to it after 3 years? That's a bold move. And hey, flooping John Ostrander wrote 2 Western miniseries in the early 2000s. I bet those are amazing. How much would it cost me to get all these books? I mean, can't be that much. So here we are, after a couple of weeks of semi-frantic shopping, reading, and then thinking about those books. I originally hadn't planned on talking about them on the show at all when I first got them. I was just curious about what this was. But as I kept thinking about particular stories or characters or takes on either of those things, though, I just found myself wanting to talk about them. And I didn't really have anybody to talk about them with, and then I realized I have a podcast where the very thing that I do is talk about comic books for too long. So brace yourself, folks. We're going back in time. My plan for this streak of episodes is to cover basically every Marvel Western published since the 90s. It is a short list, thankfully, but I am going to approach each one of these comics differently. Some of these episodes are going to follow our now standard 2 issues per episode format. Some of them might cover an entire series in one episode, or an episode may feature just a single issue. Whatever the story requires, that's what I'm going to do. Some of these books are just more interesting, or they presented a strange take that I want to explore a bit more, or they're just a really good comic that I want to pick apart. And some of them just aren't very good at all, so we'll probably breeze through some of those. The 90s, of course, are my nostalgic comics home, and thankfully, that's where we start. One of my favorite comic writers, especially of the 90s era of comics, writes our first series. This one kind of slipped by me when I was doing my shopping, but I circled the horses and rounded it up. Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 19.2 of The Two-Gun Kid, The Sunset Riders. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.